Portugal's geography with strategic access to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic permitted the country to become one of the world's earliest superpowers and has always shaped the country's way of life. To see why, join me for this brief look at the political geography of Portugal. Portugal is the 109th largest country in the world and the 19th largest in Europe, slightly bigger than the state of Maine. Once the heartland of the world's first global superpower, modern Portugal has had control over its continental present territory since 1249, when it gained its last bit of Muslim land from the Iberian Caliphate of Al-Andalus. Geographically, what distinguishes the country more than anything is its long coast, which made sailors of the Portuguese, and seafood one of the main ingredients of their cuisine. Portugal is relatively flat, with an average elevation of 372 meters, or 1,220 feet, significantly lower than the world average of 840 meters. It does have a significant mountain range, which it shares with Spain. On the Portuguese side, this is called Serra da Estrela, with a high point of 1,993 meters. This, however, is not the highest point in the country. That would be Mount Pico in the Azores at 2,351 meters. Despite its small size, it has a number of navigable rivers, including the largest, Tagus, followed by the Douro, Guadiana, and Mondego. The Tagus, in particular, has played an important role in Portuguese history because its course ends in the Atlantic, creating a natural harbor where Lisbon is located. Given how coastal Portugal is and how relatively flat it is, the country's ecological zones are few. In fact, according to the Köppen-Geiger classification, the Portuguese mainland has only 2 ecoregions. If one includes the Azores, this goes up to 4, but they are only variations on the country's Mediterranean climate. This is not to say that Portugal is always warm. The Atlantic wind and rain can make some places in the north rather unpleasant in the winter. Portugal is the 90th most populated country in the world, and the 17th in Europe, just below Sweden. It has roughly 10.5 million people, around 68% of which live in an urban setting, about 15% lower than neighboring Spain, and primarily in the 2 largest metropolitan areas, Lisbon and Porto. It is the 82nd most densely populated country in the world and the 22nd in Europe. Politically, the country is divided into 18 districts, which are similar to states in that they have a governor, but otherwise are weaker, comparably speaking. There are also 2 autonomous regions, Madeira and the Azores, who have their own organic laws and regional government. These demarcations are further subdivided into 308 municipalities, which all vary in size and wealth. These are then further subdivided into 3,092 freguesias, or civil parishes, which act as the local government. The country does not have traditional regions, so the Portuguese themselves might disagree on any particular demarcation, but for our purposes we can divide the country into 5 zones. These are the north, the center-south, the south, and the islands. We begin with the north. This part of the country is both where the modern state began and where the name for it originated. That is because what later became Portugal started in the late 9th century as a vassal county to the Kingdom of Asturias, and it took the name from Portuscale, the Roman name for an ancient Celtic town in what is now the Vila Nova de Gaia in the larger Porto metro area. Eventually, it grew in power and became recognized as an independent kingdom in 1143. As it grew, Porto developed into one of its major cities, its golden age visible along the Ribeira that overlooks the Douro River, in its monumental downtown, and the churches that define it, like its cathedral, which has been there for over 1,000 years. If you would rather taste a bit of the region's history, you can always do so at Porto's iconic market, the Mercado de Bolão. This region was also the source for another of Portugal's symbols, the rooster from Barcelos. Based in a legend about a dead rooster who comes back to life just so that he can save an innocent man from hanging, the rooster then became a symbol of the country during the 1930s, and you can find its figurines all over, but especially in the area of Minho, where Barcelos is located. Of course, the region's notable history did not begin in the medieval period. The area was part of a Roman province called Galicia, and one of its towns, Bracara Augusta, modern-day Braga, became an administrative capital within it. Today you can still see their imprint at the Termas Romanas, ancient public baths which are now surrounded by the charming medieval heart of Braga. The area boasts an even earlier settlement. Less than 20 kilometers from Braga, there's one of the country's most important Iron Age sites, a Celtic outpost called Citânia de Briteiros, which is open to visitors. The mixing of these cultures gave rise to 2 other Portuguese symbols, the caldo verde, a kind of soup that usually combines Portuguese cabbage, potatoes, and olive oil, and the most likely to have been seen abroad, vinho verde, a Portuguese wine that literally translates to green wine, but which refers not to the color, but to how quick its production process is. That is, green in this case is a reference to young. Historically, the area has been known for its Christian religiosity, making it disproportionately conservative even now. Evidence is most obvious in the many churches, especially ones like the Santuário do Bom Jesus do Monte, whose shrine in Tenoix outside of Braga is still an important pilgrimage site, and in holidays important to Catholicism, like the Ecce Homo procession in Braga for Holy Week, which aim to be devotional commemorations of Jesus' sacrifice. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was also from this region that Portugal's most famous explorer hails from, Fernão de Magalhães, or as you might know him, Fernand Magellan, celebrated for leading the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe, although he never made it back as he was killed in 1521 before he could return to Europe. Beyond that, the north is known for Portugal's only national park, the Parque Nacional da Peneda Gerês, a protected area that features lush forests of oak and over 100 granite villages. And the Douro Valley, the world's oldest known wine-producing region, which has been supplying Europe with wine since at least Roman times. It also has picturesque medieval towns like Chaves and Lamego, whose main attraction is a castle from the 5th century, as well as Guimarães, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the best preserved in the country. We now move to the center north. This area also began its modern history as a vassal county under the Kingdom of Asturias, but as the once small county of Portugal began to grow into an independent kingdom, it fused this area, the county of Coimbra, into the Portuguese realm, making this the borderland between it and the Muslim-held areas to the south. This is evident in the fortifications of places like Monsanto and Castelo Branco, both of which have castles originally built by the Knights Templar, although the latter is much better preserved, as well as the city of Almeida, which the second king of Portugal, Sancho I, had heavily fortified to deter attacks from the Moors. Almeida's strategic importance would continue in later times as the conflict shifted to other European powers like France and Spain. This contributed to the construction of a more modern fortification, the castle fortress, first began in 1641. Roman ruins are also present here, and in fact its most famous site, Coimbriga, a settlement from the 9th century BCE, is one of the country's best preserved. Meanwhile, it developed an important trading port at Aveio, where a salt and fishing market made the region thrive economically. Unfortunately, a massive storm in the winter of 1575 basically closed down the port, which led the city to stagnate, until canals were constructed to reopen access to the sea in the 19th century, at which point the cod trade brought it back to life. Around the same time, boats called moliceiros began to be used in the canals to collect algae, but today are used to tour the city's canals, earning Aveiro the moniker of the Venice of Portugal. Historically, the most important town from this region, however, is Coimbra. That is because the main university, not just in the country, but for centuries in the Portuguese-speaking world, was permanently established here in 1537. Given its prestige, it is not surprising that it counts among its graduates not just a disproportionate number of Portuguese presidents and leaders, but Portugal's first Nobel Prize winner in medicine, Antonio Egas Moniz, as well as one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, Pedro Nunes, and the person considered to be the best Portuguese poet to ever live, Luís de Camões. Today, the town and the university continue to thrive in a symbiotic relationship that makes for a pleasant visit. But that is not the only place worthy of a trip. The region is known for picturesque villages like the Piolão, a mountain village lost in time largely because, up until 1970, it could only be accessed on horse or foot. Monsanto, a town that won a contest as the most Portuguese village of Portugal, and others already mentioned, like Castelo Branco. Finally, this region is also known for being the birthplace of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, an authoritarian leader who ended up being the most important Portuguese political figure of the 20th century and who was born a little over 50 kilometers from Coimbra in Santa Comba Down in 1889. Next is the Center-South, a region that has been the heart of political power since Lisbon was made the capital in 1255 because of its more central location. This was slightly over a century after the Portuguese were able to retake the area from the Moors in 1147, a period whose main fortification, the Castle of St. George, is one of the city's main landmarks given its imposing views of the city, ocean, and Tagus River. About 200 kilometers east, on the border with Spain, there are even more impressive fortifications. A whole city, Elvas, now a UNESCO heritage site, features not just a star fort, one of the finest in Europe, but also an aqueduct. Meanwhile, other key moments in Portuguese history happened in this region as well. There was the Battle of Aljubarrota, for instance, a key win against the Castilian crown in 1385 that ensured Portuguese independence. The place from where the Portuguese explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries departed, marked by the Torre de Belém. The the Lisbon Regicide of 1908, which basically ended constitutional monarchy in the country, and more recently, the coup that led to the Portuguese transition to democracy, the so-called Carnation Revolution in 1974. History's imprint is also quite marked in the second largest city in the region, Évora. You can find not just a Roman temple from the 1st century CE, but fortified remains from the time of the Moors, medieval buildings full of azulejos, and more recently, beautiful buildings from the time the Portuguese crown made this their summer retreat. This region also happens to have one of the wealthiest strips of land in the country, the Costa do Estoril, also known as the Portuguese Riviera, in which is anchored around the towns of Estoril, Sintra, Cascais, and Oeiras, featuring a number of beaches, fortresses, and medieval buildings, including the Castle of the Moors, an Islamic fortification built between the 8th and 9th century AD, as well as the Palacio da Pena in Sintra. And just north of Lisbon, there's the place where the royals would summer, at the National Palace in Mafra, whose construction began in 1717. The Portuguese beach most likely to have been heard of abroad, however, especially if you're a surfing enthusiast, is Nazaré, an area known for gigantic waves and thus one of the most dangerous places to surf in the world. This area was also the birthplace of the most famous Portuguese music genre, fado, first made famous by a Lisbon woman known as Maria Severa in the 1820s. The genre is notorious for melancholic songs infused with a sentiment of resignation and fate. If you prefer more of a pick-me-up, this region is also where pastéis de nata originated, a neck custard tart pastry that was invented in a Lisbon monastery sometime before the 18th century. The south is the next region. This area was once an important trading post for the Phoenicians, and several of their towns were founded by them and expanded by the Carthaginians, including Tavira and Faro. It then became part of a Roman province, and one of its cities, Beja, became a settlement of note. Later, this area became the last territory in Portugal to be held by the Moors, when the Portuguese took control of Faro in 1249, making this the part of the country that lasted the longest under Islamic control. Their imprint is still seen in mosques that were converted into churches, like the ones in Silves and Martola, and some of the fortifications, especially the Castle of Silves, which they expanded, as well as in the local culture, like the Islamic festival of Martola, which takes place every 2 years. Today, the combination of history, weather, and water sports make this for the most visited part of Portugal after Lisbon, as tourists flock to see Renaissance towns like Tavira, Lagos, or Beja, wander in the museums and churches, explore the beaches around Albufeira, Lagos, and Portimão, or hike around the Alentejo coast for a combination of natural beauty and picturesque villages. And if you're a seafood lover, there is much to like as the local cuisine is built around dishes like clams, oysters, and of course sardines, which this region has been providing to the world for centuries. If you would rather opt for something sweet, there are the folhados de Tavira, a kind of puff cake coated in sugar, made famous at a local cafe in the city, or the bolas do Berlim, donuts that you're bound to encounter at the beach around Algarve. The other reason to visit is the Lulé Carnival, which is the oldest one of its kind in Portugal and which features a different theme each year. Finally, the last region are the islands. These are remnants of what once was an empire that ranged from Indonesia to Brazil. The subject of multiple myths related to Atlantis and the unknown, the islands were uninhabited by the time the Portuguese began exploring the area in the 15th century. They first settled Madeira in the 1420s, followed by the Azores soon after. As it happens, this region would have a disproportionate impact on world history because it was here that the Portuguese pioneered sugar production with the use of enslaved workers. They realized that the combination of the warm climate, winds for the mills, easy access to the sea, and slave labor combined could result in massive sugar profits and soon would expand it to Brazil, which then others transferred to the Caribbean. Once that happened, Madeira began producing wine, a very prized luxury in the Western Hemisphere for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Azores also played an important role in the country's history when Antonio, Prior of Crato, one of the claimants to the Portuguese throne, tried to rule as king from Angra, the main city in the archipelago. That was not successful, but the continued importance of the city has combined to make it one of the most picturesque towns in the entire area. Today, the region is known for its resorts and cruises, popular with the Germans and the British, although more people engage in the agricultural sector in the Azores. Regardless, both archipelagos have impressive vistas, like the view from the Farol Ponta Jarnel and the Miradouro da Vista do Rei, both in São Miguel Island in the Azores, and the Eira do Cerrado in Madeira. As it happens, this is also the birthplace of the most famous Portuguese person alive today, Cristiano Ronaldo, born in Funchal, the capital of Madeira in 1985, where he grew up until he turned 12. For roughly the last 40 years, Portugal has been divided between two main parties, the PSD, or Social Democrats, on the right, and the PS, or Socialists, on the left. This division has usually shown up geographically, with the PSD generally doing better in the north and the island of Madeira, while the opposite is true for the PS. Although in the last election, the PS did surprisingly well everywhere, giving Antonio Costa the job of Prime Minister. But perhaps a pithier way to summarize these differences is the way the Portuguese do when they say that Porto works, Braga prays, Coimbra studies, and Lisbon gets the money. And with that, we conclude our trip across the Portuguese geography. I hope you can make it there soon.